Take a look at these films here. Do you see any similarities between them? How about these scenes? Anything you see? Well, what I see in all four films are two things, all of which being released before or during the 1947 to 1960 Hollywood Blacklist, and their central theme revolving around the ideology of communism, anti-ethnocentrism, anti-establishment, anti-poverty, and a unity against the extreme right are all found in some form within these films. To get a complete understanding of these films and the historical context that they were created in, I believe it best to do it in chronological order, from before to after the Hollywood Blacklist. And with that out of the way, let's dive into communism during the Hollywood Blacklist. Released in 1943, the plot of The North Star, written by Lillian Hellman, revolves around the fictional Ukraine village of North Star, which is on the invasion path of the Nazis during their Operation Barbarossa. Sure, putting the viewers in the shoes of the Soviets isn't necessarily that communist, but the historical context of the time reveals why it is. Upon release, America was still involved within World War II, and was rampant with propaganda making it seem that all Soviet people were, in their own words, godless monsters. As FDR wanted to ally with the USSR against the Nazi regime, this American viewpoint of the Soviets was problematic to say the least. Upon realizing this, he sought out the writer Lillian Hellman to write a film that would humanize the Soviet people and make the public sympathize with them as if they were their own. And so came The North Star. By stressing the similarities between Americans and Soviets in scenes such as this one playing right here, it alienates the far-right Nazi regime, allowing the people to see that, indeed, the Nazis were the biggest threat to both America and the USSR. After the war was over and the USSR went into conflict with the USA, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, aka HUAC, used this film as evidence to further investigate communists in Hollywood, leading to the eventual blacklist. Even as those in Hollywood knew they were being directly investigated by the federal government, that didn't stop director Edward Dmytryk of the infamous Hollywood 10 from making Crossfire in 1947. Beginning with two men beating another to death, the rest of the film is focused on finding out who killed the man and why. The detective in this case, played by Robert Young, comes to the conclusion that the murder was spurred by something that was nurtured inside the murderer. That motive ended up being anti-Semitism, as the murderer, who is revealed to be an ex-soldier, tries to reason in this quote. "Oh, you know, guys that played it safe during the war, scrounged around, keeping themselves in civvies, got swell apartments, swell dames, you know the kind." Even though the theme of this film revolving around anti-Semitism has been referred to as communistic, HUAC never did a hard investigation on Crossfire, and it went on to be a success, unlike the next film in our timeline. After being forced into exile due to the blacklist, Charlie Chaplin created a response to HUAC in the form of his 1957 film, A King in New York. The film begins with King Igor Shadov as he is exiled from his kingdom and moves to New York City, an almost obvious echo of Chaplin's situation. During his financial ventures in New York City, Shadov meets Rupert McCabe, played by Chaplin's son Michael. This is a bit of their interaction, and I want you to take a listen to what McCabe is saying here.
This, Your Majesty, is Rupert, our young editor.
How do you do, Rupert?
How do you do?
Sit down. And what's that you're reading?
Karl Marx?
Surely you're not a communist.
Do I have to be a communist to read Karl Marx?
Rupert.
That's a valid answer. Well, if you're not a communist, what are you?
Nothing.
Nothing?
I dislike all forms of government.
But somebody must rule.
And I don't like the word rule.
Well, if we don't like the word rule, let's call it leadership.
Leadership in government is political power, and political power is an official form of antagonizing the people.
Although Macabre's words echo Marx's, especially with his speech on the struggles of the working people, he never directly mentions his ideology. And that's on purpose. As his parents were taken into custody by HUAC, he's sort of playing along the lines, saying these things, but never actually saying that he's a communist or a leftist or along those lines, because he's meant to represent that fear that was put into the hearts of people due to McCarthyism, that they can't be themselves or say who they are, otherwise their lives will be ruined. With the whole film centering around Shadow's and Macabre's run-ins with HUAC, Chaplin took a huge financial risk alienating the American audience. It took 16 years for A King in New York to be shown in American theaters, and by that time the Blacklist had already ended, notably in part to the final film that I want to showcase.
The night passes slowly, doesn't it? Spartacus.
Released in 1960, was directed by Stanley Kubrick and written by Dalton Trumbo, arguably the most notable of all the Hollywood 10, especially thanks to this film. Based on the novel of the same name by Howard Fast, who is a very well-known leftist author, Spartacus focuses on the slave revolt against the Roman Empire spearheaded by Spartacus. After failing to defeat the Roman army, the Romans attempt to bargain with the slaves to identify Spartacus by threatening crucifixion if they do not. This was the response they received.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
Seeing these slaves come together in loyalty to their leader, loyalty that cannot be broken with fear of death, or even worse, mirrors Trumbo's own HUAC testimony, in which he gives HUAC nothing to go off of. He doesn't comply. He doesn't submit. Take a look at this here.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Chairman, first I should like to know whether the quality of my last answer was acceptable, since I am still on the stand.
This had nothing to do with your last answer or the last question. This is a new question.
I see. Mr. Strickland, you must have some reason for asking me this question.
You can address the
You do. I understand that the members of the press have been given an alleged Communist Party card belonging to me. Is that true?
No, that's not true. You're not asking the question.
I was.
The chief investigator's asking the
I beg your
question.
pardon,
Now, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Well, you will pretty soon. The witness is excused. Impossible.
Besides the very stark differences in punishments that are showcased in the film, and the punishment that HUAC distributed to the Hollywood 10, you can tell that these scenes are almost two ways of revolting against the government. One, by being loyal to your leader, and the other, being loyal to your fellow workers, your fellow men, women, and others of the film industry, letting their message be told, not being whatever the government tells them. And we see that that doesn't even matter, because the North Star was directly being written through the government by Lillian Hellman. She was hired to do this, but the government turned their back on her and made it a point to use her films as evidence to go after others. As support for HUAC and its policies were fading away, Spartacus ended up succeeding not only critically, but financially. Even though Trumbo was still quote-unquote blacklisted, his name was on all the advertising. From the very beginning, they said that this film was being written by Dalton Trumbo. Yet, people went to go see it. Enough people that it basically killed the blacklist. It made it that people would be allowed to make what they want again. And so, from a film that brings unity against the Nazi regime, while changing how Americans view themselves compared to the Soviets, to a film that was made to bring unity against HUAC and establish the effects of poverty directly caused by the authoritarian Roman Empire, communist film in Blacklist America both started and ended the blacklist by appealing to its most powerful force, we the people.